everyone. I'm Dr. Susan Protasio, and welcome to this Conversation Matters podcast, and it is episode 33. Our conversation today is about indigenous people, and I'm sure not many of you are familiar with the term indigenous people. So, our guest today will share his wisdom and knowledge about the indigenous community. And my guest today is a multi-talented man. He is the Mental Health Program Director at the Caroline Wiley Center. He is a licensed psychotherapist in California and has a master's degree in social work with emphasis on families and children. So let's welcome our guest, Mr. Javier Garcia. Welcome, Javier.
Thank you, Dr. Susan. I appreciate your time. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm sure our audience is curious. Who is this multi-talented man that is my guest? So
Yes.
could you please introduce yourself to our audience?
Absolutely. Thank you for that great introduction, warm introduction.
Okay.
Yeah, my name is Javier Garcia, as you mentioned. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I am a director of mental health, but I also have a private practice on the side.
Okay.
I specialize in trauma treatment, eating disorder treatment, as well as working with what we call high acuity. That's behaviors that put somebody at risk, such as suicidality, homicidality, psychosis. In addition to that, I specialize in indigenous focused mental health, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment.
Yeah.
Aside from that, personally, my family, myself, we identify as macehualli. Macehualli is a Nahuatl word.
Yeah.
Nahuatl is a Euro-Aztecan language, predominantly used in Mesoamerica, Middle America. In addition to that, I am married, happily married. In my spare time, when we're not wrangling our 7 schnauzers, I'm playing my wewet, that's our ancestral drum. I'm cultivating my milpa, and it allows me to have a connection with my ancestors, with my culture, with my indigenous roots.
Yeah, that's nice. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
You know, so mental health care is a very broad topic, but I would like to focus on the mental health care in indigenous people because it is not often talked about.
Yeah.
So can you share with us, what does the word indigenous mean? Because not many are familiar with it.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So the term indigenous in and of itself, you know, it's a Latin word. It means sprung from the land. But as far as culturally speaking, it refers to the original inhabitants of a land, of a region. And this term, you know, indigenous really speaks to a community who has deep ancestral, spiritual, cultural ties to the land, to the environment, to the biosphere, to the biology in that environment, kind of a reciprocal relationship.
Okay.
And furthermore, when we talk about indigeneity or indigenous identity, it's difficult to talk about without discussing colonization.
Yeah, that's true.
And so colonization would be an external group trying to impose their will, impose their belief system and structure onto indigenous communities. So when we talk about colonization, you know, this definition would be an external group, an outside group seeking to occupy, seeking to take over and impose their religious views, their system of governance onto other groups, in this case indigenous groups. It is important to recognize that indigenous cultures seek to maintain, seek to reclaim their indigenous practices, their ancestral practices, in spite of colonial tactics and strategies to erase the culture.
Right. And I would like to share also that in the Philippines, there is this indigenous people of the Philippines are diverse, and they are categorized according into major groups depending on their you know, geographic location and their cultural practices. So we have also the Igorots, we have the Lumad, and we have the Negritos, and these these indigenous people are the non-dominant sector in society, you know. So what are the challenges that are faced by the indigenous community?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question.
Yeah.
You know, as a provider of health, really we see it twofold, right? We see the impacts on physical health, and then we see the impacts on mental health. With regards to mental health, right, we see disproportionate, staggering statistics. You know, for example, 20% of indigenous community members, American Indian, Alaska Native, will experience one major mental health episode per year. That's 20% of the population. Suicide, for example. Suicide rates are just through the roof with our American Indian, Alaska Native community members. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for indigenous youth. And suicidality, or the statistics with suicidality in our indigenous communities, is the highest out of any population that is in existence right now in the United States.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. When it comes to the physical challenges, yeah, thank you. The physical challenges and disparities, we often see high levels of infant mortality. We see high levels of cardiovascular issues,
diabetes, probably, you know, hypertension. You know?
Oftentimes, I get asked a question. You know, what happens when we interrupt indigenous ways of nourishing themselves, right? Indigenous people have been cultivating the land for thousands of years, and we know the answer to that. A good example is the Pima Indian in Arizona. They have the highest rate of type 2 diabetes on the planet, right? 1 in every 3 adults are diagnosed with diabetes.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a lot. So, and they also, the indigenous community, they also face, you know, social and cultural challenges, you know, like marginalization, racism, that affects their access to education, to healthcare, and to the justice system. They also have economic disparities, you know. I read an article about the indigenous community, and it says, indigenous communities' numerous challenges over centuries often stem from historical events. And in this results in various trauma, like historical trauma, racism, and then cultural displacement. So can you explain briefly what is historical trauma?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So historical trauma refers to the idea of a cumulative and collective emotional, spiritual, physical, mental, communal wounding inflicted by colonizing or settling groups. And oftentimes, with regards to historical trauma, it's rooted in dehumanization. It's rooted in power differentials and power struggles and domination.
Just like, I would say the examples like the genocide, the slavery, like forced assimilation, and you could see some articles that mentions about the boarding schools at those times, you know. So those are, that would classify as historical trauma that affects the mental health, right, of the indigenous people.
Absolutely.
So with that being said, what is the difference in the presentation of the symptoms of mental health in indigenous community and the general population? Is there any difference?
Yes, yeah. So interesting question. It's twofold, yes and no. So the yes part would be our indigenous communities face the same challenges as the general population. You know, depression, anxiety, difficulty with adjusting to certain life situations, substance abuse. But the no part would be the difference in severity, the difference in prevalence, and also how it's expressed and the meaning behind the symptomology, behind the struggles.
Because like you said, I think the difference lies in that historical trauma that they went through or still undergoing compared to the general population.
Exactly.
You know?
Exactly.
So talking about historical trauma, we cannot just not mention transgenerational trauma and intergenerational trauma because these are important. They affect the way these mental health symptoms, appear or occurs in the indigenous community. So can you explain briefly what are those and why is it important?
Sure. Yeah. Definitely. I think it's much needed. These
Yeah.
terms are often foreign, even in our mental health field.
Yeah.
So with regards to intergenerational trauma, what we want to identify, what we want to understand is it's trauma passed down and across interfamilies, so
Okay.
trauma within family units. I'll give you an example, domestic violence. If we have a community that has faced oppression, how are those parents coping with that level of oppression? Maybe the parents engage in healthy ways of coping.
Yeah.
Maybe they connect with ancestry, do ancestral healing practices, seek mental health services, or the opposite, right?
Right.
The parents might engage in unhealthy practices, substance abuse, domestic violence, and all of a sudden that child is seeing their parents and learning how to interact with their loved ones.
Yeah.
And then we have transgenerational trauma,
Okay.
transmission of trauma across generations.
Okay.
Oftentimes, signs of transgenerational trauma are internalized oppression, internalized racism, profound grief and loss. Oftentimes, what we see is less westernized concepts of symptomology and more survival strategies of how people are trying to navigate ongoing oppression.
Yeah, that is so true. And sometimes, like, the Western way of diagnosing a certain mental health condition is different in a certain way, because I had this discussion with the Asian Pacific Islander community in one of their conferences, and the discussion was that in Western culture, there is this diagnostic criteria that you follow to be able to diagnose, like, say, depression or anxiety, right? But then the Asian Pacific Islander community or other or indigenous people, they have a certain way of expressing sadness, depressions. And so if they come in now to the office of a healthcare professional and say their symptoms, and then this professional would follow the criteria, then whatever they're saying doesn't fall to the criteria, right? So what happened now is either that symptoms that the person is saying, it could be underdiagnosed or just could be just disregarded. Oh, this is not depression because the symptoms doesn't fall in the diagnostic criteria.
Exactly. Exactly.
So that is something to think about and ponder, So when we say, to recap what he said, when we say intergenerational trauma, it focuses on trauma passed from one generation to the next within families.
Within families.
Within families, like domestic violence, right? And then when we say transgenerational trauma, it refers to trauma affecting multiple generations, including collective or cultural groups. So it is a collective trauma. Example is the Holocaust or slavery, right? And the reason we're discussing it is because it plays a role in all these mental health conditions that we see in the indigenous community.
Exactly. Exactly.
So in your bio, you mentioned that you identify as macehualli, right? That's how macehualli.
Thank you, Susan. Yes, that's exactly correct.
So a term referring to indigenous people, and you are part of the Nawa community.
Exactly.
So could you please share it with us?
Definitely, I'd love to. As I mentioned, we identify as macehualli, which is a root word from the Nahuatl language, which is macehualtin. That means human or person. Historically, the Nahuatl language was the lingua franca of Mesoamerica. It was used throughout, right, the region. Even if communities weren't Nahuatl, they knew the language as part of intercommerce and trade. Some examples of cultures that speak Nahuatl would be Pipil, Tepenacs, Tlaxcalans, Mexica, Toltec, for example. Currently, right now, it's the most prevalent indigenous language in Mesoamerica or Central America.
This is my first time, actually, to be honest with you. This is my first time to hear of the Nawa community. And at first, when I saw it, I said, I think this is read as Nahua. Then until I spoke to you, it's Nawa, right? So is there like, do you still speak the language?
I do. I do.
So how do you say, let's say, how are you?
Yes,
How do
yes.
you say it in your language?
So,
Probably a different way.
yeah, yes, definitely. The language, excellent. For example, one of the words would be thank you, which is laso kamati. That's a literal translation of the word to thank you, but really its significance is, my breath or my words to you, to your heart. So oftentimes Nawat words have double or even triple significance and meaning.
Oh, that's wonderful. It sounds like it sounds like an ordinary thank you, but it has like more of like an expression or a deeper meaning.
Exactly.
So that's
Exactly.
wonderful. So thank you for sharing
Thank
your
you.
community. Thank you.
Of course.
So now you provide mental health workshops, like you try to focus on bridging the normal clinical treatments with these ancestral healing traditions.
Yes,
And you
yes.
call it, I think, as indigenous informed psychotherapy framework. So can you explain that in simple terms? Because it sounds to me complicated, but
Yeah.
like indigenous informed psychotherapy framework. So what is
Absolutely.
that?
Yeah. Simply put, it's psychotherapy that honors and respects ancestral ways of healing.
Okay.
For example, I was able to attend a sweat with the Kauia.
Oh yeah, I know that. Yeah.
During the winter solstice. How can we apply these ancestral ways of healing into our mental health practices, knowing that that's what our indigenous communities gravitate towards, and they've gravitated towards for many, many years, many generations.
Yeah.
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 Following up with that, spirituality is a huge component of indigenous focused mental health when it's applied ethically, legally, and when a client, a family, is asking for it, seeking to receive it. But oftentimes our field of mental health, distances itself from spirituality, the fear of incorporating that into treatment. And it can be really profound. Nothing in the rule book says that spirituality or indigenous focused practices go against evidence-based practices. They often complement each other.
Yeah. And help the person seeking healing because of their spiritual beliefs,
Exactly.
So are there like cores of this, informed psychotherapy framework?
Are there cores?
Yeah, are there core in it? Does this framework see the whole person? You see the whole person, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So one thing, indigenous focused mental health does is it asks the clinician to see the client in this holistic way. The individual is important, but it's just as important the collective, right? The mind, the body, spirit, spirituality, community. Oftentimes with our indigenous communities, symptomology, symptoms are embodied. So we use a lot of somatic focused interventions. Yeah.
And I like what you said that when you see patients in your clinic, you don't say what is wrong with this person, rather what happened to this person's family, the community, the people, their beliefs, spiritual beliefs. So it's like you're looking at the totality that could have caused or contributed to these symptoms of mental health conditions.
Exactly. We want our clinicians who are working with our indigenous communities and non-Western community members to ask not only what's wrong with you, client, but also, or in addition to, what happened to you, right? What happened to your family? What happened to your people? And that gives us a comprehensive, assessment of where we can come in and assist.
So you could see the bigger picture.
Exactly.
Because if you just focus on the person or the client that came into your office, then you might miss other contributing factors,
Exactly.
So that's wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. So do you think then that the spiritual belief of like the indigenous people or a particular client plays a big role in their healing?
Yeah, definitely. Again, if done ethically and legally, Here in California, we have the Establishment Clause, we have the California No Preference Clause, and the Lemon Test. But working with non-Indigenous community members as well, spirituality can strengthen resilience. Spirituality is known, especially in our field of mental health and outside, to foster a sense of development, of identity, to feel a sense of belonging and connection to a higher power. When working with trauma, right, it can help make meaning of suffering. Really, we see it as a great protective factor when used, again, ethically and appropriately.
Whatever helps. I think that especially the spiritual belief can be so strong to give that person hope while transitioning to that period of healing. So if there is one thing you would like to share with our audience about Indigenous community or mental health care about Indigenous community, what would that be?
Yeah, wow. Such a profound question, of the one of many things. I think number one is that our Indigenous community members, our Indigenous people around the world, they're not relics of the past, right? They're living people. And also they're not defined by their trauma, right? They embody and carry ancestral knowledge that all of humanity can benefit from, ways of how to interact with our environment, and create a reciprocal relationship with our environment.
And I think you mentioned also how many Indigenous people are there in the world?
Right now,
a lot.
Absolutely. It's 400, roughly about 470 million individuals. And what that equates to is that 6% of humanity, of human population, stewards and takes care of 80% of the remaining biodiversity. In other words, in simple terms, 6% of humanity takes care of the remaining life on this planet for the sake of not only themselves, but for everybody.
And to think of that, not a lot of people really familiar with the word indigenous. The first time I heard it, before I joined a certain organization, I was not familiar with it. And then I thought, okay, let me look it up. And what does indigenous means, So that was amazing. So I hope, we were able to help them and understand this community.
So I'd like to share a quote from Chief Seattle of the Duwamish. Humankind has not woven the web of life. We are but one thread within it. What we do to the web, we do to ourselves. All things are bound together, all things connected. Graso Kamati, thank you. Absolutely.
So thank you so much, Javier, for sharing your Nawa community, for sharing your wisdom and knowledge about Indigenous community.
Thank you.
And due to the limited time that we have in this episode, we barely scratched the surface of mental health care in Indigenous people. But Javier and I hope that we were able to give you a better understanding of what the Indigenous community is and their constant struggles and challenges in exerting that effort to preserve their identities and their heritage, the cultural heritage. So before we end, let me share with you this quote. Tradition is the thread that binds us across generations, and through the lens of our ancestors, we see the path to healing and hope. So thank you so much. Be sure you take care of yourselves and do not lose sight of who you are and your blessings.